take a drink, turn off the lights, and listen carefully. Because inside every asylum, silence doesn't heal, it hides. Welcome to the shadows of the asylum.
My name is Ethan, and ever since I was a boy, I've carried a hollow ache where my mother should have been. She left when I was 5, and my father always told me I'd never see her again. Still, that emptiness lingered, gnawing at me through every night and every quiet moment. Maybe that's why I chose psychiatry, to understand people, their minds, and perhaps to understand the emptiness inside myself. After graduating, I was assigned to a small-town psychiatric hospital. The building was old, with walls that seemed to sag and floors that groaned under every step. From the outside, it looked harmless enough, quaint even, but inside it reeked of something older than disinfectant. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and the sour smell of sweat. From my first day, I noticed the patients were neglected. Some had bruises along their arms and necks, some had cuts that were poorly bandaged, and others sat all day staring blankly at walls, their eyes hollow. The staff, at first polite, revealed their cruelty once the sun went down. Patients were screamed at, strapped to chairs, denied food, and sometimes locked in tiny rooms with only a thin mattress. I started talking to the patients. One woman, her hair matted and eyes wide, whispered to me, They force us to sit for hours without moving. If we speak, they hit us." I nodded, heart pounding, trying to hide my fear. A young man, barely more than a teenager, trembled as he explained, They give us pills, so many we can barely move, then make us stand in corners for hours. They tell us it's for therapy, but it hurts." I could feel a mix of horror and anger building inside me. I couldn't just watch. Every night I stayed late, observing. I saw patients tied to chairs, sometimes for hours, while nurses shouted at them or poured cold water on their faces. Some were forced to eat only small portions, while the staff laughed, mocking their cries. One elderly man, shaking with age, told me about the therapies they forced. Isolation in small, dark rooms for days, sometimes weeks. No light, no human contact, nothing but silence and the sound of their own despair. I realized this was systematic. The hospital was a machine for breaking people, hidden behind the excuse of treatment. Nights in the hospital became unbearable. I wandered the corridors after hours, talking quietly with patients who trusted me just enough to whisper the horrors they endured. One young woman, barely out of her teens, clutched my sleeve and whispered, They lock me in the small room for days. No food, no light. They say it's for my own mind, but I hear screams from the others. Sometimes they hurt each other, or they hurt us. They watch and laugh." An older man, his hands trembling, told me he had been tied to a chair for 2 days straight because he refused medication. He said, "They strip you of your clothes sometimes, so you feel exposed, and then they leave you, just left with yourself and your fear." I felt bile rise in my throat. These weren't just patients, these were prisoners. The nurses and doctors, the staff I had initially trusted, were cruel beyond measure. Cold water baths in the middle of the night, electric shocks disguised as therapy, endless injections that left bodies numb and minds terrified. Some patients had bruises across their faces, others had sores from being strapped down too long. Despite the fear gnawing at me, I kept asking questions. A middle-aged man in the corner muttered about the training sessions. He said the staff would force patients to relive their worst memories, screaming at them, ignoring their cries until they broke down completely. I shivered. This place was systematic, ritualistic in its cruelty. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Each patient's story added to a growing mosaic of horror. I started to document everything in secret. I took notes, memorized staff rotations, and hid files I found lying around. A young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, whispered to me about a room at the end of the east wing. They don't come back the same. The screams never stop. They leave us there, sometimes forever. The fear in his eyes was real, tangible, and yet there was something else, trust. He trusted me enough to tell me, and that trust gave me courage. I started sneaking more frequently into the restricted areas, observing treatments and documenting abuses. I saw patients restrained on metal tables while machines made jolts of electricity pass through their bodies. I saw the therapy sessions where nurses shouted commands over terrified patients, forcing them to recount traumatic events while ignoring their pleas for help. I saw young women locked in rooms with no light for days. The staff justified it as treatment, but I knew the truth. This was punishment disguised as medicine. Systematic, cruel, inhumane. Every corner of the hospital carried whispers of suffering, and I had no one to tell but myself until I finally stumbled upon a clue that changed everything.
One evening, as I rifled through patient files in a quiet office, I found a name that stopped my heart. My mother. She was here, hidden among the patients, trapped in the very place I was uncovering as a machine of terror. My hands shook. How had I not known sooner? The file detailed her history. She had resisted treatment, attempted to escape multiple times, and each time staff punished her severely. Isolation, deprivation, and forced medication had worn her down over the years. I felt a surge of rage and urgency. I had to find her. I memorized her room number, staff rotations, and security routines. Every corridor now felt alive with danger, every shadow a potential threat. That night, I resolved. I would speak to her, I would see her face, and I would find a way to get her out. The hospital might control everything else, but it would not control my resolve. I started spending more nights inside the hospital, hiding under stairwells and behind old wardrobes, catching fragments of cruelty that daylight hid. The staff operated in routines, efficiency masked as care. Yet each routine carried a ritual of humiliation. One nurse took pleasure in shaving another patient's head while she laughed and told him he had no worth. A doctor I observed once barked orders as he injected a trembling woman with something that made her stop crying mid-sob and stare through me as if the light behind her eyes had gone out. Conversations grew longer, deeper. A patient named Maria told me about the quiet rooms where they stripped people of blankets and voice for days. "It's how they break you," she whispered. "Rain comes inside you and you drown." Another, an ex-firefighter, showed me scars where he'd been restrained, and then he described how the nurses took their phones into sealed rooms and filmed the patients in their most broken moments. He said the footage was used as training, and I imagined it circulating like a private currency, shame traded for promotions and cover-ups. The rot wasn't a few bad apples. It was systemic. Files altered, relatives lied to, pain dressed up as therapy. Each time I walked away from a patient's bed, I felt my stomach twist with helplessness and righteous fury. I wrote it all down at night, burning the pages only when the risk of discovery felt too close. But the record of what I had seen lived inside me, no matter how many flames I fed. One night, a brittle-faced woman named Claire told me something that made my blood run cold. She said, "They take him to the basement sometimes," touching my sleeve with fingers that shook like dry leaves. "They call it their lab. Machines hum there like bees. You can hear it through the floorboards." I asked her what they did. She looked away, eyes filling, and said one word: testing. I had noticed the vibration in the deepest nights, the steady, mechanical hum under the soles of my shoes. I traced it and found, behind a false panel, a stairwell leading down into a part of the building that was not on any map. The door at the bottom was heavy,
bolted and labeled with a faded plaque, "Research and Therapy." My pulse thudded against my ribs as I listened. Through the crack, I could hear distant voices and the soft, unhuman beeping of machines. When I slipped inside once, I found rooms filled with apparatuses that looked half scientific, half torture. A device for binding limbs like a crude dental chair, glass cabinets with syringes laid out like instruments, and folders full of notes written in a clinical, amoral hand. Patients were strapped to tables, wires taped to their temples. In one shadowed corner, a nurse monitored a screen where a patient's face moved like a puppet under the steady hand of anesthesia. The more I watched, the more I realized that the hospital was experimenting on people, on the vulnerable people who had nowhere else to go. This was beyond neglect. This was deliberate, considered cruelty disguised as research. I left with hands trembling, knowing the stakes were higher than I had imagined. If I exposed them, they could destroy me. If I did nothing, they would continue. I started to move with a purpose that felt like a rope around my chest. I needed proof, but proof required risk. I learned the night camera's blind spots, the timing of rounds, and the names of the staff who made threats into policy. More patients trusted me. More of them risked telling everything. There was Tomas, who described an experiment where staff used loud recordings of his childhood yelling to make him hyperventilate until they deemed him reset. There was Elena, whose eyes still flickered at night, who spoke of injections that silenced memory for days. My notes became a choking dossier. I photographed what I could, stuffed papers into my coat, and whispered to the bravest patients that I would try to get them out. They smiled as if someone had spoken a word they had not heard in years, hope, but their smiles were fragile, easily broken. The administration's veneer of respectability was unmasked by tiny, brutal acts. The way food trays were left cold at doorways, the way staff responded to complaints with empty forms and strategic benevolence. I began to sense a watchfulness. Eyes in hallways seemed to follow me longer. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. A clean-suited doctor, Dr. Whitman, smiled at me in the cafeteria with a predatory calm that made my skin prickle. He had a way of saying, "You're young," that sounded like a threat and a prediction. It was clear I had found a hornet's nest. The question was how to move without getting stung dead.
Finding files had become both ritual and compulsion. In a locked cabinet behind the pharmacy, I discovered patient records that were annotated with corrections in a different hand, names blacked out, dates erased. One folder contained a list of transfers to external medical facilities, but the destinations were blank. Another folder had photos, faces of people whose eyes had been hollowed by shock, with scribbled notes about dosages, responses, and suppression intervals. Then I found her name again, not just typed in a line among hundreds, but circled here with marginalia. Resistance noted. Escapes attempted 3. Recommendation, intensive containment. My mother's file had dates that matched years when I had wondered where she had gone. The handwriting described punishments, long isolation, induced dehydration, forced medication intended to make her unable to formulate escape plans. I read lines that made me sick. There were references to an external doctor, a consultant, who periodically oversaw treatments, recorded observations, and signed off on protocols that read like recipes for erasure. His name was signed at the bottom of the pages, Dr. Mercer. I traced the name to a hospital in the next county, a place with a white facade and a reputation for good emergency care. If Dr. Mercer was involved here, the rot extended beyond the brick walls of the asylum. I left with a plan and with fear. I would get her out. The thought sharpened something inside me. Anger became focus. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. The people who ran this place had friends in other places. We were dealing with a network, not a single greedy institution. I started to plan in the margins of my life. I told no one, but I spoke often with the most lucid patients, mapping exits in my head like points on a battlefield. My mother's gait was slow. She walked with a tiny limp I'd forgotten. She had moments of lucidity where she would look at me with a flash of the woman who'd read me bedtime stories and hummed soft songs. In those moments she apologized, soft, foolish murmurs about what she'd done and what had happened. I stopped listening for blame and started listening for fact. She told me about strangers in white coats who responded to pain with paperwork, and about nights where men with no empathy entered rooms to conduct tests that made people forget entire afternoons. On a storm-slicked night, I put the plan into motion. I bribed a young orderly with cigarettes to leave a door unlocked for 10 minutes. I coordinated with a group of patients who could walk without drawing notice. The route took us through the laundry room, down a narrow corridor that bypassed the main cameras, and out a side gate that opened into the tangle of trees behind the hospital. As we moved, I kept whispering, "Stay behind me. Don't cry. Don't look back." The patients followed like moths to light, brittle and hopeful. For a heartbeat, I felt like a rescuer of old legends. Then a radio crackled. A voice barked, "Extra security on the west wing. Checkpoints up." My throat closed. Someone had seen something. Panic rose like bile. We ran. Feet thudded, wood groaned, doors slapped. A nurse rounded a corner too soon and called out, "Stop!" The sound of pursuit multiplied as staff poured from offices in slippers and shoes. Patients scattered like leaves. I grabbed my mother, who swung her arms weakly, and we forced our way through a service door into the cold night. The forest swallowed us at first, branches scratching. For a bare moment the dark felt like mercy. I clutched my mother's arm, feeling her ribs tremble under my grip. Then, as we pushed farther, she stumbled over a root and collapsed. I caught her, and her eyes looked at me in a way I had only imagined in fevered dreams, clear as glass and steady like a lighthouse. She said, "Go, please, live." I held her and argued, something human clinging to hope. But she was already slipping. Her breathing was thin. Her skin was a canvas of bruises and numbness from sedatives. I took her to the only place I could think of, the county hospital across the valley, a place Dr. Mercer had been known to visit. It was farther than we wanted, but perhaps distance meant anonymity. With the last of my strength, I carried her through the trees until I reached a road. I flagged down a passing car, lied about an accident, and begged the driver to take us to the nearest emergency room. He would not ask questions when he saw my face and the shaking woman in my arms. Pity is sometimes louder than curiosity. The county hospital was bright in a way the asylum never was. Fluorescent lights buzzed mercilessly, and a nurse's voice sliced through the sterile air. They wheeled my mother in, and for a moment I thought perhaps truth and emergency care would finally align. I told her everything in a blur, how I found her, what the hospital had done, how she was frail and slipping. They led us to a triage room and took her vitals. A doctor came in, clean, efficient, and then something in his face shifted when he saw the file I clutched. He asked her about her history, flipping through my hastily copied notes. My heart pounded. I asked him, "Can you keep her? Can you help?" He nodded, and for a second I allowed myself to breathe. They moved her into a room for observation. I sat in a plastic chair in the corridor, hands numb, waiting. A nurse brought coffee. Another nurse brought a chart. The hours stretched. Outside, rain pooled in the gutters, and the world felt impossibly distant. Men and women in blue scrubs passed by, some kind, some indifferent. I tried to sleep, but found only snatches of memory. My mother humming, then her whisper that I must live.
At dawn, a doctor I didn't recognize came in with an easy smile that did not reach his eyes. He said his name, Dr. Mercer. Time stopped. Everything in my stomach dropped. The man whose signature had sanctioned my mother's treatment in the files was standing before me, folding his hands like a man about to sermonize. Funny, running into you, he said casually, glancing at the chart. He moved with the leisurely confidence of someone who owns corridors and schedules. I tried to stand, to demand answers, but the nurse placed a firm hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "We need to do more tests." Dr. Mercer's smile thinned into something polite and predatory. I watched as he reviewed her notes I had smuggled. His fingers tapped through pages, and then he looked up with a gaze that made my scalp prickle. "She has been through a lot," he said. "We'll take care of her." There was a pattern I'd seen before. Sweet words that smoothed the conscience while the hands prepared the instruments. I asked him directly, voice raw, "Were you involved with her treatment at the psychiatric hospital?" He hesitated a moment, and then said, "I consult with several institutions. We try to help those who can't help themselves." There was a lie in the cadence that I had learned to recognize. I was allowed to be with her for a short while under observation. My mother's breath rattled like old leaves, and when her eyes opened, they fixed on mine with an urgency that burned through me. "Ethan, you did right." I squeezed her hand, tears soaking my palm. She coughed and then closed her eyes, exhausted. I asked for updates. Nurses came and went with clipboard rituals. Dr. Mercer appeared occasionally, always polite, always just beyond the thin curtain. He ordered blood tests and scans with clinical detachment. When I asked about her prognosis, he would smile and say, "We'll see." There was always a pause that tasted like a warning. As midday fell, the corridor emptied. The hum of the air conditioning grew louder in my ears. I debated staying by her bedside all night, but a soft-voiced nurse insisted I step into the waiting area. No family members were allowed to camp endlessly. I obeyed, pacing like an animal in a cage, listening for any sound, every footstep, every whisper. Night came, and with it a stillness that wrapped around my shoulders. I snuck back into the observation area with a hand-me-down excuse. My watch had stopped, or so I told the nurse, and she let me pass with a flicker of sympathy. The room smelled of antiseptic and the rueful tang of hospital coffee. My mother slept fitfully, and I watched monitors tick like distant metronomes. At about 2 in the morning, the door opened softly, and Dr. Mercer entered. He moved as if sneaking into a theater performance he had rehearsed 1,000 times. I rose and confronted him, voice a low growl. "What are you doing here at this hour?" He offered a smile that was almost fond. "Follow up," he said. "I'm making sure she's stable." He checked the IV, the oxygen, and then spoke to a nurse about medication adjustments. I watched his hand move to a small vial on the cart, a clear liquid with no label visible from where I stood. He explained, in the tone of a man explaining the weather, that he would give a small sedative to ease her pain. I should have run then. I should have ripped the vial from his hand and screamed. Instead, I hesitated for a heartbeat that cost everything. He drew the injection with the effortless precision of a man who'd done it countless times. The nurse, quiet and resigned, prepped the syringe. As he leaned close to my mother, I saw not compassion, but a cold satisfaction. He looked at me, and for a strangled instant I thought I saw pity there. Then he said softly, "We've been waiting for you." The words were winter. He pushed the plunger. My mother's eyelids fluttered, then stilled. The monitors kept their mechanical chorus for a breath, then a line flattened where a heartbeat had been. The world condensed into a single terrible scream that pressed against my ribs. I lunged, but hands, strong, practiced, held me back. Nurses murmured reassurances as if reciting a lullaby. I remember the smell of antiseptic and the metallic tang of my own panic. I remember Dr. Mercer folding his hands, as tidy as the signature at the bottom of her file. He said, "I'm sorry, we did what we had to." His voice was a blade wrapped in silk. They told me she had gone peacefully. They offered condolences in measured tones, but they could not hide the fact that a man who had coordinated her treatment in the asylum had followed her to this very room and ended her life with a needle and a line that sounded rehearsed. I left the hospital not in tears, but in a silent, boiling void.
After that night, the world blurred into reconnaissance and fevered records. I could not accept it as fate. I had her file, the photos, the notes with Dr. Mercer's signature. I had witnesses among the patients and a list of abuses that could make headlines. Yet the system moved like a sluice gate. Evidence could be hidden, reputations bought, and the grief of one man minimized by institutional fortitude. I started to share copies of what I had with trusted journalists and an attorney who specialized in institutional abuse. I memorized faces that could corroborate my story. Patients who had once been too broken to speak found voices again when told their testimonies could end this cycle. The hospital pushed back, lawyers, denials, threats, but the seeds had been sown. A power that had relied on secrecy feared light. At times I felt consumed by vengeance. I wanted to expose Dr. Mercer's connection to the asylum publicly, to drag him into the fluorescent glare of accountability. But I was not reckless. I built a case slowly, painfully, knowing that truth, when documented properly, becomes harder to smother. Months later, inquiries began. A local reporter ran a piece about missing patients, and their editor demanded proof. The attorney I'd trusted filed a complaint. Legal teams combed through records. The hospital, shivering under scrutiny, tried to perform humble contrition. Policy changes, saccharine apologies, a few staff suspended pending internal review. But lawyers wore down moral outrage like rain on stone. They were slow-moving and patient. Dr. Mercer was placed on administrative leave with a careful press release that called for further investigation. The courtroom showed its own character, some faces sympathetic, others invested in maintaining the status quo. A few former patients testified, hands shaking, but true. The public watched as small victories were won, arrests, charges, media coverage. But some things never returned. The nights my mother hummed, the warmth of her small hand in mine. I continued my work in mental health advocacy, haunted but driven. The asylum shadow still followed me in long, quiet hours, but out of that darkness came purpose. I told the story not for vengeance alone, but for prevention, for the patients who would never leave, for the ones who did and were broken, and for the mother who taught me that even in the darkest rooms, a single act of love could become a lantern.
My name's Adam, and I make short documentaries about abandoned places for a small YouTube channel. Last fall, I got a tip about an old hospital deep in the mountains, St. Allen Sanatorium. It was shut down back in the 80s after several patients died under mysterious circumstances. Not ghosts, not curses, just negligence and silence. At least, that's what I thought. I went there alone, with my camera, a tripod, and a flashlight. When I arrived, wind howled through broken windows, echoing through empty hallways. The floors were covered in glass and damp papers, the smell of mold thick in the air. It was supposed to be just another location shoot, but something felt wrong the moment I stepped inside.
Right at the entrance, I found something strange. A small leather notebook lying on the floor. It wasn't dusty like everything else. It looked recent. When I opened it, I saw dates. 2021, 2022. Not from the 80s. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. The first entry read, "I keep hearing noises from the basement. Thought it was rats, but the rhythm's too human." Below that, one more line. "If you're reading this, don't go down there." I froze for a second. Maybe I wasn't the first one who came here to film. But where was the person who wrote this?
Of course, I ignored the warning. The basement stairs were narrow, metal railings cold against my skin. At the bottom, a rusted door marked archives. It opened easily, too easily. Inside were shelves covered in dust, except for one. One was clean. On a nearby table sat a camera, same model I used. Next to it, a half-empty bottle of water, a sleeping bag, a few empty cans. Someone had been living down here, and judging by the notebook upstairs not long ago. I checked the camera. The first clip showed a man, mid-30s, wearing a dirty hoodie, his flashlight shining directly into the lens. "If you find this," he whispered, "you're not alone here." Then, faint footsteps, breathing. The clip ended abruptly. The next one was pure darkness, just static and the faint creak of a door opening. A whisper followed. "Leave it there." I paused the video. There wasn't static. There was a voice, and it sounded close, human close. Another notebook sat near the sleeping bag. More scribbled notes. "He walks the hallways at night, always at 3:12. Never seen his face, only the uniform." Then a number, 431. Room 431 was on the 3rd floor. When I found it, the door said, "Staff only." Inside, everything looked freshly cleaned, and on the desk was a modern smartphone. Dead battery, but I plugged it into my power bank. The last video file opened immediately. "If you're watching this," the man said, his voice shaking, "he's real. It's not a ghost. It's a man." Then my phone buzzed. A text message. It said, "Don't go upstairs. I'm in 431. I looked up, heart pounding. The door behind me, the one I left open, slowly closed. The handle turned. Not fast, just testing. I switched off my light and held my breath. The footsteps paused outside, then walked away. When I finally ran outside, I didn't stop until I reached my car. I left the notebook behind. Later that night, I reviewed my footage. In one of the last clips, you could see a faint reflection in a window. Behind me stood a man. No mask, no ghostly shape, just a person wearing a headlamp. In his hand was my notebook, the one I dropped in the basement. The timestamp on the footage read 3:12 a.m. I never uploaded the video. I deleted everything, sold my gear, shut down the channel. But sometimes when I wake up late at night, I hear a quiet tapping on my window. 3 slow knocks, and I always remember the last words written in that notebook. Those who film the truth become part of it.
Some walls never forget. They still whisper long after everyone's gone. If you felt the chill tonight, leave a like, subscribe for more stories, and maybe keep one light on. You'll thank me later.